Our third presenter is Susan Fletcher. She's a historian and archivist for the Navigators, where she documents and interprets the history of Glen Erie. A native of Colorado Springs, Fletcher's experience as a docent at the McAllister House Museum and as an intern at the Western Museum of Mining and Industry convinced her to pursue a full-time history career. She's the co-author of Dawson Trotman in his own words and of several articles on Pikes Peak regional history. She also serves as the chairman of the Colorado Springs Historic Preservation Board with the term expiring in early summer. I don't know. I won't even comment
expired.
on that.
We have our new chair, Mike Herbst, over here. He's in the audience. So.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Great. I have something to confess to you, and I might as well get it out of the way now. I'm a museum nerd. Now, I think that this is probably the very best kind of nerd you're going to be if you're going to have to be a nerd. So because I love museums so much, I decided to pull back the curtain on one of our most shocking secrets. So our theme today is myths and mysteries, and I have something to tell you. Not everything that you've been told in a museum is true. And we as museum professionals don't always know everything about our museum collections. And sometimes we have wild and crazy tales circulating around our institutions. According to Mary Miley Theobald of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, every day stories that are not true are repeated in museums, national parks, and historic sites. Some are outright fabrications. Others contain a kernel of truth that has been embellished over the years. Because they are catchy, humorous, or shocking, these stories often stick in our heads when quieter information slips away. Today I'm going to talk about myths and mysteries in local museums, focusing on 3 different areas. 1, docent myths, the not quite true information that gets circulated around tour guides and then passed along to the public. Number 2, mysterious riddles or puzzles to solve within our own collections. And number 3, wild urban legends where the truth is often stranger than fiction. Most of the following case studies are taken from museums around the Front Range. Let's begin our behind-the-scenes tour of the mysterious and wild world of museums with docent myth number 1. So the summer after my freshman year in college, I got my first museum gig giving tours at a local house museum. This was a small institution, and they didn't have an education curator. They just had a person in charge, and then a lot of older docents. So my training was pretty common to the way docents are trained in a lot of small places like that one. An older docent simply gave me a tour guide book and told me to memorize it. And then I followed a couple of them around, and they turned me loose about 2 weeks later to give tours on my own. Now, as an 18-year-old at her first museum job, I took everything that the tour script had to say as the gospel truth. And as for the older docents, everything they had to say, I mean, that had to be true, right? They would never, ever make anything up, of course. It wasn't until I started interning at larger institutions and taking historic site administration courses in grad school that I realized that not everything in that script was true, and that some of the things I heard from the other docents weren't quite true either. In the museum world, we like to call these things docent myths. Information that gets passed around from person to person, the information which may or may not have been true in the first place, that becomes increasingly corrupted as the stories get passed along. So think of the children's game of telephone. If I were to ask the first person in each row to come up with a statement and whisper it down the row, I bet that the thing that the last person in line were to repeat would be pretty different than what the first person came up with. So you can see how easy it is for information to get corrupted. Sometimes these myths are completely unintentional and take the form of widely misunderstood stories or false identification of objects. According to Theobald, history myths are not history mistakes. They usually seek to explain something, such as why kitchens in the South were separate from the main house. Some are based on mistakes or erroneous beliefs, or make us feel superior, or tease our interest in codes. So here's some few examples of docent myths that you may have heard. And as I'm going along, you can raise your hand if you've ever heard these, whether here in the Pikes Peak region or anywhere else. The first one, the myth of the closetless house. So how many of you have heard this? Houses back in the 1800s and the colonial era didn't have closets because people wanted to avoid paying the closet tax. Have any of you guys heard that before? Well, at one of the museums that I came up in as a young 18-year-old, that was written into our tour script. Supposedly, the house plans of this museum were based on colonial architecture, and the house plans that they were supposedly based off of didn't have closets. Because apparently, in the colonial era, people were taxed based on the number of rooms they had in their house. And any room that had a door on it, any space that had a door on it was considered a room, so you would be taxed. So supposedly, houses in that era didn't have closets because people didn't want to be taxed, supposedly. According to Theobald, however, research has turned up no examples of a tax on closets in any of the original 13 colonies. Early houses did in fact have closets, but not as many as we have today because they were simply not necessities. Clothes hangers didn't come into use until after the Civil War, so prior to that time, clothing would have been folded into drawers or hung on nails. So they just didn't need as many closet spaces as we have today. Number 2, the chair myth. How many of you have heard that the male person, like the dad of the family, would sit in an armchair in the parlor, whereas the woman would sit in a chair that had no arms because the chair without arms was built to accommodate her wide skirts? How many of you guys have heard that? I have one in the back, a couple. So this is another myth that we shared at our museum. This was the parlor chair that supposedly the woman of the family sat in because she had such large skirts and bustles. According to Theobald, however, these chairs were actually invented in the 1500s. But by the 1800s, people had already made up this mistake. They were starting to call this type of chair the farthingale chair, mistakenly linking the chair's purpose to the wide hoop skirts that ladies once wore. So these were not built to accommodate wide hoop skirts. Number 3. Now, I bet that I don't know if most of you, I bet a lot of you have heard this one. This is the statue code. So supposedly, the position of a horse's legs on an equestrian statue tells us how the rider died. How many of you have heard that? How many of you tell that to your friends and act like you know more than they do? So this is a myth that plays into our inherent love for codes and patterns and for sounding smarter than our neighbors. Supposedly, if one hoof is raised, the soldier was wounded in battle. If 2 hooves are raised, he died in battle. And if all 4 hooves are on the ground, he survived. Thank goodness that General Palmer's horse has all 4 hooves on the ground, right? Theobald thinks that this myth started at Gettysburg, where many of the memorial statues do in fact follow this pattern, but many do not. In fact, historians have pointed to many examples at Gettysburg where this is clearly wrong, but this myth won't die. You can also look around cities like Washington, D.C. and Boston and some of the larger cities that have a lot of memorial statues. Some of the statues do follow this code, but a lot don't. This is a statue at Gettysburg. This is James Longstreet. And so if this code were always true in all cases, James Longstreet would have been wounded in the war because his horse has a raised hoof. In fact, Longstreet escaped the battle unscathed. And number 4, the myth of the fainting couch. How many of you have been in Victorian house museums where the tour guides proudly display their fainting couch and tell you that those poor ladies in the Victorian era, their corsets made them faint all the time, and this is the fainting couch where they used to lay them out? How many of you have heard that? The fainting couch was actually not invented in the Victorian era to catch fainting ladies. According to Theobald, the flat daybed piece of furniture has been around since ancient Egypt and Rome, who were clearly not wearing corsets. Ancient Egyptians and Romans used daybeds for reclining, not to catch themselves if they fainted. The daybed was simply a fashionable piece of furniture found in many Victorian parlors, but it was not designed or reserved to catch fainting women. So these 4 myths are pretty common across the country. You could go to a historic house museum in Massachusetts and you might hear the same thing. Most of these myths are repeated over and over by docents who hear them from other people and who take them as truth and who simply just repeat them. So they're pretty innocent mistakes. Other times, however, docents purposely invent myths in order to improve on the truth, in order to make their historic site more exciting. Elizabeth Barber, the lead interpreter at Rockledge Ranch, has one such story. She told me that one day she was doing some work in the orchard house when she overheard one of her junior docents talking about some chamber pots. The junior docent was telling the story. So the chamber pots with gold were used by the rich Slater family, and the chamber pots that were plain were used by their poor servants. This might sound like a pretty logical conclusion for a junior docent to come to, but it's simply not true. Elizabeth took the docent aside and explained to her that the decoration of a chamber pot has absolutely no bearing on class structure. Furthermore, the chamber pots in that particular space were original to the house at all. They're simply antiques that were purchased much later to complete the furnishings of the exhibit space. After she had been gently reprimanded, the docent persisted in telling the story anyway, insisting that it just made things more exciting. Elizabeth also overhears her docents making up stories about the everyday question: how many people lived in this house, in regards to the small replica Galloway cabin on the property. She told me that the numbers are growing increasingly large. 6, 10, 12. 12 people definitely lived in this house, and this was definitely the standard size of house for 12 people. Elizabeth thinks that her docents like to shock their audience with the number of people who could potentially cram themselves into a small space. But in the end, she reminds the docents that there is no standard size for houses in this era. She would like to remind us that settlers built houses as effectively as they could with the materials available to them. Furthermore, this cabin wasn't original at all. Galloway never lived there. An artisan recreated it in 1979, so actually no one lived there, certainly not 12 people. Elizabeth also wants us to remember that when we start talking about people in generic terms, such as they would have crammed 12 of themselves into a cabin like this, we tend to spread false information. It's always so much better to talk about the specifics of your historic site rather than making generalizations that could easily lead to false tales. Careful research is the key to making sure the information presented at museums is true. Now, Elizabeth has quite a bit of experience at the museum, starting out her own career there in the ranks of interpreter. When she came into her own role as a supervisor, she decided to make sure that all of the stories her fellow docents were telling were actually true. Elizabeth says, "I would highly encourage any museum docent or staff member to question where the original information came from and to ask questions about that. If you can't find a primary source, it's questionable. A lot of younger docents take it on faith that the older staff and docents know what they're talking about. I don't think people intentionally spread false information. They just keep repeating the same story." Elizabeth was particularly curious about the story an older docent told about Robert Chambers taking his entire life savings out in cash and traveling across the country with a roll of $10,000 in bills. Now, if that doesn't sound like a lot, that would be about $175,000 in cash in today's money. So think about selling your own house and getting the entire payment in cash and then migrating west with it. Does that sound ridiculous? Elizabeth thought so too, so she did some investigating in the primary sources. She found Mary Chambers DeLong's account of her parents' trip west, which reads, "Father started out with his sister Nettie, 2 children, and his wife, who was expecting another baby. They all left on the train in 1874 with Father's $10,000 in cash from his wheat crop and Aunt Nettie's farm sale money, all in cash with just a tiny pistol not more than 8 inches long, including the handle to protect them all. However, after leaving Aunt Nettie in Wisconsin, they arrived safely in Denver without having to draw the pistol. On the train, he would pull out a roll of money big enough to choke a horse and would make Mother so mad. But it was common practice in those days." So after confirming that that story was true, Elizabeth decided that she should probably confirm all of the more wild tales that were floating around the museum. History really is a large mystery, a riddle to piece together using primary source material. The museum interprets the Rockledge House as a former boarding house in which Robert and Elsie would take in boarders to make extra money. So Barbara began wondering if that story was actually true as well. And so she asked herself specific questions like, if this really were a boarding house, how did they advertise? How did they get customers? What were the rates? So she went to the newspapers from the time period and quickly got her answers. In an advertisement in the Gazette, she found a notice that Mr. R.M. Chambers has just finished his handsome stone residence near the Garden of the Gods and has opened a boarding house. Already he has quite a number of guests for this season, and we understand that they are delighted with the location. Mrs. Chambers also took in day guests as well, offering lunch for 50 cents apiece with a snack of milk and crackers for 15 cents. This brings us to the second kind of museum myth and mystery: mysterious collections and curiosities that baffle museum staff. Now, as a collection manager, I know that there are often objects in my collection that have no provenance. Provenance is where something came from or who donated it, and it's really important for us to be able to know the backstory of something. We also have objects that we simply don't know what are. Back on the west side, Elizabeth Barber also began wondering about a mysterious stone on the Rockledge house, which is this right here. So this is a keystone on one of the first floor windows on the Rockledge house. Although all of the stones above the windows on the house are pretty much the same, this is the only stone that has this particular marking painted upon it. Elizabeth thought that this might have been a later addition to the house after the family had left, but she quickly discovered in a photo from the time period that it was original. So she and her staff began wondering, what is this symbol? And what does it mean? Is this a Ute symbol? Is this a cattle brand? Is this like a tradesman's mark? Is this a Masonic symbol? What does this mean? In the end, as much research as they did, they actually never found anything. And so Elizabeth wanted me to say, if you happen to know anything about the symbol, you can let us know about that, because they would love to know the answer. Now, this mysterious wreck is pretty tame compared to some of the other museum myths and mysteries. When I was doing my initial research for this paper, I sent out a survey to my museum colleagues across the Front Range, asking them for the popular myths and mysteries at their institutions. My friend Victoria Miller is a curator of the Steelworks Center of the West in Pueblo, and she was the first to respond with a whopper of a tale. The Steelworks Museum is housed in the former CFNI Steel Mill Medical Dispensary and administrative offices. CFNI filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1990, and Evraz took over the operations of the mill in 2006. Victoria told me that when the museum first opened in the early 2000s, she would frequently get old-time museum steel workers and old neighbors from Bessemer who would tell her the following story. Apparently, the Pueblo Sheriff's Office would burn seized illegal marijuana in the steel mill furnaces, and workers and neighbors claimed to have gotten high from the fumes. Crazy story, right? Couldn't possibly be true. A few years later, a new archivist at the museum found a personnel file in the archives with a letter of disciplinary note and a letter of rebuttal. Apparently, a certain steelworker had been caught napping on the job and had gotten fired. He rebutted this, saying, "It was one of the days that the sheriff's department was burning pot, and I was high and sleepy." To the archivist's surprise, there was even an envelope of dried-out marijuana in the personnel file, purportedly as evidence. The museum staff dutifully destroyed the drugs and concluded that the man had likely smoked the pot on his own, blaming his inebriation on a wild tale. Now, when Victoria first told me about this myth in January, she really did think it was just a story. And then one day in April, she sent me an email reading, "Hey, check out this article in today's Pueblo Chieftain newspaper. This is what I was talking about. In the old days, CFNI really did burn confiscated marijuana, and now Evraz is doing it too. An urban legend, no more." According to the article written on April 29th of this year, the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office has now seized approximately 4,500 marijuana plants from illegal home-grow operations in the county in just 1 month, which begs the question, what is being done with all the plants seized? I mean, how often do we wonder, what do they do when they seize illegal pot? I have no idea. Sheriff Taylor says that the Sheriff's Office typically uses a local crematorium or, on occasion, Evraz's facility to incinerate the plants. Indeed, an urban legend no more. I did some further investigating, and the Pueblo Sheriff's Office has been destroying illegal marijuana in the old CFNA steel mill since at least the 1970s. These are some pictures from Operation Flypaper in 2012. The Sheriff's Department did a raid of a grow operation in the San Luis Valley, and they burned 14,000 plants in the steel mill. Former superintendent of materials handling at the CFNI steel mill, Alan Cinnabon, even wrote a short novel about a pot burning incident that he witnessed himself. In 1979, an airplane in distress landed at the Pueblo airport, containing 20,000 pounds of Colombian marijuana. According to his author's website, the persons involved were subsequently apprehended and their marijuana was burned in the CF&I blast furnace. The myth of the whole workforce and the neighbors getting high off the fumes, however, is probably just an exaggerated rumor. According to Sheriff spokeswoman Lori Kilpatrick, the high temperature of the furnaces incinerates the plants, producing no smoke, and the plant's filter controls prevent any bad stuff, such as THC, from escaping into the air. Although I did just read a story in the New York Daily Times about an entire village in Indonesia that got high off of a pot-burning bonfire, so who knows? The next time you visit a museum, think carefully about the information that the docents or staff are presenting to you. I know that I've spent the last several minutes explaining how sometimes what we're telling you isn't true, but actually, I do want to emphasize that museums are a reliable source. Most museums have dedicated staff members, such as Elizabeth, who work carefully to ensure that what their museums are interpreting to you are true. Like a good historian, weigh issues that you're thinking about. And if you hear a tour guide talking about the vague people back then, rather than specific individuals associated with the site, take the opportunity to explore the matter on your own. And if you're interested in more museum myths, there's an excellent book called Death by Petticoat by Mary Miley Theobald. You can explore more docent myths and other mysteries in museums.
Our final presenter before lunch, Rick, we're going to go to lunch. Rick joined the U.S. Air Force and History Museum program in 1984 and has been Air Force Space Command Deputy Director of History since 1999. An internationally recognized authority on U.S. military space history, he appears frequently as a lecturer on aerospace history topics and, in addition to writing classified official histories, has published extensively in open literature. He serves on the editorial board of Quest, the History of Spaceflight Quarterly, and is editor of the International Academy of Astronautics History Service. Rick.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to just ask, sort of poll the audience here, how many of you believe in UFOs? Not as many as I thought. How many of you have seen a UFO? Okay. Keep that in mind as we go here. Reported sightings of strange aerial phenomena across the Rocky Mountain region have a lengthy history. One very early report involved James Lumley, you see there on the right, a fur trapper in Montana, who witnessed a bright luminous body in the heavens in 1865. At the crash site, Lumley described finding, quote, an immense stone driven into the side of a mountain. And when he looked at the stone closely, he saw on the surface what he described as curious hieroglyphics. About 4 decades later, in April 1897, a crash of reports across the Colorado and other states described mysterious airship sightings. One resident of Cripple Creek actually saw the airship drop a note and then sink over Mount Pisgah, and another swore that it crashed over New York Mountain in Eagle County. A survey of the purported crash scene and New York Mountain turned up no evidence whatsoever of a crash. But as you can see in the lower right, Midwestern humor suggested that the airship might have only been a flying corncob. A half-century later is where the story really begins. In June 1947, a Boise, Idaho businessman flying his plane over Washington's Cascade Mountains witnessed very peculiar-looking objects that he described as flying in a saucer-like fashion near Mount Rainier. The media quickly sensationalized the objects as flying saucers. Within days, residents of many Western communities reported seeing similar kinds of flying saucers. Denver even had an entire disc armada, and dozens of Denverites reported it, as the newspaper headline shows. Then we come to, at virtually the same time as the Denver armadas, a discovery of mysterious debris by a rancher near Roswell, New Mexico, caused considerable excitement, but only for a very brief time. When a young public affairs officer at Roswell Army Airfield informed a local reporter that the debris the rancher had discovered might have been simply a flying disc, the next day's headlines read, "RAAF captures flying saucer." Within 24 hours, on the right-hand side, the headlines in the same paper read a little bit differently, because the commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, announced the excitement was unjustified. The debris was just that of a high-altitude weather balloon that had crashed in a storm. Nonetheless, as you can see from the headlines, the press considered calling it a saucer and continued to do that. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the Air Force released information about the once classified Project Mogul, which involved experimental high-altitude balloon flights to acoustically detect Soviet atomic weapons tests halfway around the world. These balloons would go up to about 90,000 to 100,000 feet, and they carried this little piece of equipment that could detect the acoustic noises from the atomic blasts at that distance. And it is likely that a Project Mogul balloon was one that crashed and caused the Roswell incident. You can see on the right how they're preparing the balloon and what it would have looked like in flight. And these things were maybe 50, 60 feet in height from the balloon down to the bottom of all of these reflectors and detectors. Other Air Force projects in New Mexico during the 1950s involved dropping anthropomorphic dummies to study how a pilot or astronaut might parachute safely to Earth from an extremely high altitude. Some of you might remember Captain Joseph Kittinger. He jumped from over 109,000 feet and almost broke the sound barrier in the late 1950s. He did that down in New Mexico, and in one of the earlier flights had been injured and was taken to the hospital, and some reports would suggest that the red-haired captain that enters into some of the Roswell stories was actually Joe Kittinger when he was injured in that earlier flight. An Air Force study in 1997 suggested that the likelihood of reported sightings of dead aliens or injured aliens and crashed spacecraft originated from these kinds of tests. And so by the 1990s, cartoonists were having a lot of fun with all of this. But for people who believe in UFOs and that they were really galactic spaceships piloted by aliens, the mystery of what happened at Roswell had taken on mythical proportions by this time. I especially like the cartoon in the top where he says, "Uh-oh, we're going to crash. Quick, throw out the Air Force dummies." And so at this point, let me sort of remind you that a mystery, by definition, is something that's difficult or impossible to understand or explain. That would be something like the debris that the rancher found after the storm at Roswell. But a myth is a little different. It's a traditional story, especially one that explains natural or social phenomena, typically involving supernatural beings or events. So I would contend that's what happened with the Roswell incident over these decades. Well, let's go to another incident. Some of you might have heard of this. Many haven't. In March 1950, a man introduced simply as Mr. X described to a University of Denver audience how an alien spaceship had crashed near Aztec, New Mexico in 1948. He claimed that a scientist identified as Dr. G had found advanced alien technology at the crash site. You see the two individuals in the upper left there. The names of the speaker and scientist were respectively Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. That was discovered later. These two gentlemen also convinced magazine columnist Frank Scully to write a book about the Aztec incident and the recovery of an alien gadget that could benefit petroleum prospecting. Newton and Gebauer began raising money from investors to produce copies of this alien gadget. It was called a doodlebug, and there were other such gadgets that were named the same thing. They marketed the gadgets for $800,000 apiece to oil men all over the western United States. In fact, the two men were scam artists, and the doodlebugs were really war surplus items that they bought at war surplus sales for $3.50 average apiece. One unwitting investor, wealthy Denver industrialist, oil man, and rancher, Herman Fletcher, invested $50,000 in this. And when he discovered that this was all a con and he'd been defrauded, he exposed them, took them to court, and in the process exposed the Aztec incident as a hoax. This was in 1952 in the Denver courtrooms. Despite its being a hoax, one that researchers later found had originated with a prankish tale printed by Aztec Independent Review editor George Baura 2 years before the incident supposedly happened in 1948, UFO believers persisted in their efforts to prove that the alien crash really did happen. And like the Roswell incident, what became known as the Aztec incident has evolved mythologically and continues to the present day. Now, the media are great. For at least half a century, science fiction filmmakers have joined reporters, authors, and media types in promoting the UFO mystery as mythological encounters between Earthlings and intergalactic aliens. The Rocky Mountain region has been a prominent setting for at least 2 such movies. I even watched one last night just to prep myself for this. Earth versus the Flying Saucers came out in 1956, and it featured, this might sound familiar, Hemispheric Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs. The Hemispheric Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs was to oversee the military response to this alien invasion in New Mexico, where the aliens were trying to blow up all of America's long-range rockets, which were being, at this point, developed and experimented with to carry nuclear weapons. So the aliens were trying to do a good thing, right? The other one that you might be familiar with, and I watched last night, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, came out in 1977, probably one of the best of the UFO movies ever to be produced. And you can get it at Walmart now for $5. Anyway, Spielberg in this movie, it concludes with the spectacular landing of a giant flying saucer at Devil's Tower National Monument in northeastern Wyoming. And these kinds of films created in the popular culture this wonderful notion that there just might be aliens out there we don't know. Okay, then things become a little more sinister. During the mid-1970s, news reports of widespread mutilation of livestock whipped up anxiety among Westerners, and it happened right here in El Paso County. And thank you to Dennis. He provided me with all kinds of newspaper headlines on this over about a 2-year period. This occurred right here in Colorado Springs and the ranch lands to the east. Initially, law enforcement officials suspected that the ritual activity of satanic cults was responsible for mutilating cattle and horses and other kinds of livestock. The prevalence of black helicopters in the vicinity of mutilations soon led to suspicions about secret projects involving the Defense Department. And then in February 1976, Frederick Smith, the owner of a small ranch on Colorado's western slope, published a booklet in which he blamed aliens for cattle mutilation. And there you see him holding the booklet. And you can find copies of this online, by the way. It's interesting reading. But Smith asserted in this booklet that extraterrestrials could borrow as many helicopters from Fort Carson as they wished, and they could hangar them in the sky, he didn't say exactly where in the sky, until they needed them for their next cattle raid. So this all spun up, and mutilation mystery became mythical. And you see a couple of artist concepts there of how the cattle are getting sucked up into the saucer. I especially like the little cartoon on the left where the 2 aliens are out and they're talking to this horse and they're saying, "Kindly take us to your president." And the map shows where the prevalence of the mutilations are occurring. And you can see, I mean, Colorado's almost blotted out there with stick pins. Some UFO investigators perceived a geographic correlation between nuclear sites, such as Los Alamos, and the high incidence of mutilation cases. the vicinity of Dulce, New Mexico, fit that description. And in December of 1967, Lawrence Radiation Laboratory and El Paso Natural Gas Company, with funding from the Atomic Energy Commission, had in fact carried out Project Gas Buggy, not too far from Dulce. This was an underground nuclear explosion to fracture sandstone formations for the extraction of natural gas. Project kind of failed, but nevertheless, they had to drill into the mountain and blow up this atomic weapon. Also, around the same time, in the vicinity of Dulce, ranchers Edmund and Manuel Gomez had found many of their cattle mutilated, and they began to believe and touted, along with one of the local sheriffs, that UFOs were operating out of a nearby underground base and were responsible for the animal mutilations. So here you see it, Dulce Base. Rumors spread about a secret base under Archuleta Mesa near Dulce, where scientists from Los Alamos were working on experiments involving aliens who were transported there by UFOs. And according to one story, aliens and humans had battled for control of Dulce Base in 1979, and humans had triumphed, but only after losing 60 of their own men. I don't know if you can see clear in the back the diagram here, but you can see how the UFO is coming in at the top of Dulce Base, and it can go down in there somewhere. And you've got a shuttle that's running underground from Los Alamos, and you've got all kinds of genetic experiments and cryptogenic storage of the aliens, and there's some living aliens, so they're housed on level 5. And so this is Dulce Base. Okay, and I'll leave it to you to figure out whether you think that's mythological or whether it actually exists. But one of the things that belief in UFOs by many people has allowed is for communities where UFO sightings tend to happen frequently become tourist attractions. And community boosters have realized that they could rake in tourist dollars by touting their geographic proximity to these UFO sightings. The most successful of those ventures undoubtedly has been the Roswell Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico. It opened in 1992, and it continues to thrive. And on the left, you can see there's a sign for the actual site, which is not in Roswell, actually, it's quite a ways away. Another attraction is right here at Hooper in our own San Luis Valley, where Judy Messelin, after she'd watched programs on TV like The X-Files, really started to believe in all of this, and she knew about a lot of sightings in the San Luis Valley, and they do happen there. But in May of 2000, she opened the UFO Watchtower at Hooper, and there you can see it. Has anybody been there? One person almost raised their hand, and a couple of others have. So, but that's one that's nearby, and we could go and check it out. Founded in the late 1990s, but gone sometime before 2014, was Area 51 Research Center in tiny Rachel, Nevada. Rachel, now, if you're going to try to go there, it doesn't even have a gas station. So, you know, but it's near Area 51, and Rachel's Little Alien Cafe still shares UFO information for those of you who want to go there, but you have to pay. You have to buy a cheeseburger and fries, and then they'll share the information with you. So what do we make of all of this? Polls suggest, and it was a higher number than what I had for hands raised here, that somewhere between a third and half of all Americans believe UFOs exist and have transported aliens to Earth. There's a difference between existence and transportation, right? A larger percentage of the American population believes that intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe. And more than half of those surveyed believe that the government has conspired to cover up the fact. So I end by asking again, what do we make of all of this? And I would ask you to remember that UFO is precisely what the letters stand for, an unidentified flying object. That's all it is. It's a mystery. A UFO is a mystery stripped of the myths that have developed around the belief in UFOs. So what should we do? Well, I'll follow the title of one of the books that I use in the paper extensively. We should watch the skies. And someday we might solve the mystery.
We have about 5 minutes for questions if our presenters will come up. And while they're coming up, Steve's presentation reminded me of an actual exploded myth in my family, okay? My brother believed in Santa Claus. I hope he's not online. My brother believed in Santa Claus till he was 8, and my mother was came from no-nonsense German peasant background, and she said to my father, "That child needs to be told the truth." So my father takes him into the bedroom for a talk on Santa Claus, not the other talk. Okay, a talk on Santa Claus, and my brother and I are outside wondering what's going to happen, what's going to happen. We hear this wail, "Ah!" And then he says, "I suppose that means there's no Easter Bunny either." Questions? Yes?
I just have it's more of a comment and something for me to research. This is from Susan. I liked your story about the closetless house. I'm wondering when your supervisors told you that story, if it was something that they were passed along from generations. Well, it's supposed to be.
Susan, I'll repeat the question. Was the story about closetless houses passed on from generation to generation? In other words, how are myths perpetuated?
Okay, so in that particular museum, that was written into the tour guide script, which is like, the textbook for all museum tour guides. And supposedly in this house, the house was supposedly based off of, I want to say like a Downing cottage, and I'm totally spacing out on like when that would have been built, but it would have been based on it was like one of the revival styles, so it would have been based on a much older house, kind of like we today, sometimes make period revival houses. So if they were supposedly basing it off of, a previous era house, and anyway, that was written into the tour script, and that's just what we all said. So.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Just the reason I ask it is because we were stationed in the military back in the 80s, and one of the things we found in European houses where there were no closets, we were told, just what you had shared, that it was because of taxes. So that makes me want to go back and research if that was true.
Yeah, I don't know about Europe. A lot of what we talk about today is, this colonial revival house, they were taxed in the colonial era. So, I mean, this myth, so many of the docent myths are not true and also kind of true. They have kernels of truth, so it might be that in Europe that was true, and they kind of adopted that here, just while it was technically not taxed to have closets, maybe the settlers or maybe the early colonial people didn't build closets because they were just used to that in Europe. So I don't know. I mean, that's something that might contain a kernel of truth from an earlier time.
Another question. Yes, ma'am. Rick. Rick, did you see a flying saucer? And what did he see?
I believe in UFOs simply because you all should. They're unidentified flying objects. But I did not see a flying saucer. However, one morning I got up early. This was about a year and a half ago. And in the east, just before sunrise, I saw the whitest, brightest, largest object that I've ever seen outside the moon. And the moon, of course, at that point would have been toward the west, and this was in the east. And it startled me for a second. It was an unidentified flying object for a second until I realized that it was Venus, and the parallax effect of the atmosphere was causing it to look that large. But I tell you, if you ever see something like that, it will give you pause.
Maybe those aliens were using Venus.
Well, I don't know. I didn't see any aliens.
Another question. Yeah, way back there.
We have the card
Okay, what happened to the solid Muldoon?
Yeah, the Cardiff Giant was George Hall's first hoax. The Solid Muldoon, I think after it was revealed to be a hoax, they stuck it in a New York basement, and I think the Solid Muldoon, yeah, and I don't know. Someone may know, and it may still be out there. It's made of blood and bones and meat, and it's probably not something I would want nearby. But I think it was probably somewhere in New York.
One more question. Yes, ma'am.
I can't ask my son-in-law that's a high-ranking pilot in the Air Force, but Rick, do you ever listen to Coast to Coast radio show with Rick or George Norrie?
Does Rick
Have
ever
you
listen?
ever listened to that?
Does Rick ever listen to Coast Radio? It's True Confessions time, Rick.
No, I'm not aware of it at all. I've never listened to it.